My journey with Dr. Myles Munroe. This is segment 3. This segment we're going to call The Legend of the Ruffneck Pastor. To get an understanding of what that title means, we have to go back a few years. I started in the ministry with Dr. Munroe. He asked me to be the youth pastor. I didn't have any experience or understanding of what it was to be a normal youth pastor. So I just began to rely on my background to make a difference. So I went into parks, I went into playgrounds, I went into neighborhoods or hoods as you would call them. I reached out directly to gang members, drug addicts, criminals, and began to invite them to church. I also connected with some young men who were involved in hip hop and reggae who had gotten saved. And so we went into communities and we just did music and we shared the gospel, we gave testimonies, and we saw a tremendous impact. We also went into schools where I would take classrooms of gang members and just sit down and talk with them and reason with them. Eventually, our outreaches garnered massive attention in the nation. So we were pulling in for some of our events anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000 during the course of a week. We had entire gangs that had gotten saved. I mean, hundreds of gang members were coming into the church. We were busing them into the church. They were coming over to my house. We were having barbecues, playing basketball, and it was just a massive impact. The impact was so massive that the Prime Minister of the Bahamas at the time actually called me and my associate at the time, who was Carlos Reed, who together we had mounted a campaign called Peace on the Streets. The Prime Minister called us into his office and said, "We will pay you for what you are doing. We have never seen anything like this before, where so many gang members had turned their lives around." So this began the legend of the Ruffneck Pastor. So I was engaged very heavily in reaching the streets. Many of these young men respected me. I could go in just about every neighborhood, and the gang members actually respected me. I began to mentor some of those gang members, and eventually many of these gang members not only got saved, but they became husbands, fathers, model citizens in the community. Today, some of them are pastors. One of them is actually the pastor of 2 of our churches. Another is an international recording artist. Another is a businessman, and the list goes on. And so in the Bahamas, this nickname became attached to me, and it was given to me by the gang members. They said, "No, you're not a regular pastor, you're a Ruffneck pastor." And so we began to continue to have impact. And one of the interesting things about that period was not only did I introduce these young men to the church, but they also got introduced to Dr. Munroe, and he ended up mentoring a number of these young men, being in their lives. He participated in some of our outreaches. He participated in some of our special events. And so together, we actually blazed the trail. I mentioned before that he was blazing a trail in the country, impacting the entire country and eventually the world. And on a parallel track, the Ruffneck Pastor was the pastor for youth in the Bahamas. We created all kinds of events that were not seen before in church. We had what we call the Christian Youth Talent Jam, and many young talented artists came out of that. Record labels were born. Globally known and renowned artists launched their careers through this ministry. So it was a really exciting period. It was a different period. Many church people didn't understand, didn't appreciate what we were doing. Of course, my appearance and the way I carried myself was not a typical pastor role, so people were a little taken aback. But the young people were coming in by the numbers. I mean, we had even gang leaders approach me without me approaching them and say, man, we heard about what you're doing and we want to talk to you. I actually, it got to a point where some gangs said to me, they said, well, look, it looks like you only go to this particular gang. There was a gang called the Rebellion, and the Rebellion was, I had quite a few friends in the Rebellion, and so some of the other groups, the Dogs and the Hoyas and others, they said, it looks like you only go to the Rebellion. And so they invited me into their communities. It was just amazing. And so we had tremendous impact. But this was a significant period. It was a period of growth. It was a period of transition. It was one of those exciting elements of my journey with Dr. Myles Munroe that will go down in history as a remarkable period. Eventually, we began to train some of these young people. Some of these young people became youth leaders, got involved in the ministry. We hired one of the gang members, and he developed a sound company. He became our sound engineer. Another worked in video and so on. And so this was just a tremendous example of what the kingdom message and the gospel could do when people come together. Dr. Munroe came as the visionary. I joined as an early partner, a foundational partner, and we blazed the trail just by letting our light shine. And so this is that period where when people talk, if you come to the Bahamas, some of the older generation, the younger generation, doesn't know it as much as the older generation, even though I was just reminded recently, someone actually wrote an article in the paper, wrote a note in the paper and on YouTube, and they said, Pastor Dave, you'll never live down the nickname of the Ruffneck pastor. So that's the legend of the Ruffneck pastor. It involved so many crazy activities. You know, I ended up mediating gang wars. I ended up, mediating fights. I had some of these guys over to my home for dinner. We prayed for them. We prayed for their girlfriends. I ended up doing some of their weddings. So it was just a tremendous period, and it was a part of the journey with Dr. Myles Munroe. Dr. Myles Munroe played a major role in, first of all, allowing me to do what I did, because not many churches would have allowed that, and then also embracing it and becoming a part of it and actually mentoring some of these young people. So as we continue further in our journey, you'll hear the rest of the story.